Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 16 on the series of videos on warfare through time. And this video, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking still in the industrial era and we're looking at the experience of war. Now, what do we mean by that? Recruitment, training, and the impact of war on civilians. They're the three things we'll look at in this video. And when I say industrial era, once again, I'm going to divide this into two. The first video we'll look at 1700 to 1850. If you remember this from our previous videos, we see that the rate of change was very, very slow and gradual in those 150 years. So we're looking mainly at continuity, and we'll be looking at why there was so little change during those 150 years in recruitment, training and impact of war. The video after that, 1850 onwards, then we'll concentrate more on change. So let's have a look. First of all, recruitment. Now, if you remember, Britain did have a standing army, quite a small standing army, maybe average about 40,000 soldiers. Round about from the end of the Civil War through the 1700s. Well, they had a standing army in practice. In theory, they didn't actually pass a law in Parliament till 1775. But the standing army was quite small. If you remember, people were reluctant because they feared the power of the army. But, nevertheless, there was still a need to recruit men. How did recruitment happen? From 1700 to 1850. That's what I'm going to talk about now. Well, let's look at two different parts of the army. First of all, the officers, the posher people, often from rich, wealthy backgrounds, rich, wealthy families. Now, these families often had land, and the eldest son would inherit the estate and look after the land. Other sons, younger sons, then looked towards the army as a career. And basically they would say, right, we need to buy a commission. It was called the purchase system. They are spending money, the family is actually buying their son into the army. For example, if he went in at the if he went in at the role of lieutenant, quite high up, that would cost £1,000, a huge sum of money in that period. In return, of course, the officer would get status, a lifestyle, and a long-term income. So the officers basically bought their jobs. That's how they were recruited. Is that a good system? Well, have a think. Maybe there are some drawbacks. What about the quality of the men who are coming into the army at a high level, taking command? Is there any guarantee that they're going to be brave, skillful, experienced? Do they know what they're doing? Are they going to be good soldiers? There was no guarantee. And basically they learned from experience on the job. Compare that. The 1700s, the officers are basically buying a job, even though they might not be very good. Compare that to the new model army at the end of the English Civil War, where Cromwell was saying, give me a russet-coated gentleman. Remember, there the emphasis was more on quality rather than background. Well, it seems as if maybe things have regressed, things have got worse in that particular regard. So that's how the officers were recruited. What about the other men, other ranks lower down the scale, the infantry, if you like? How did they get recruited? Well, who went into the army? Well, the first thing we need to say, in the 1700s and into the early parts of the 1800s, it tended to be the poorer people. 50% plus were labourers. 90% of the army were illiterate. They could not read or write, compared to 30% in the whole of society. So we're seeing that the people who are going into the army maybe were not that well educated. So let's have a think. How did they start? How did they get into the army? Well, you could join, you could enlist for a short period of time. Now, when I say short, I mean 8 to 12 years. Or some people would enlist for life, and that was a period of 21 years. But still not enough people are enlisting, not enough people are joining the army. There was a shortage. Any reasons why? Well, pay. The pay was low. From 1660 through to 1792, it was only 8 pence a day. That was lower than a labourer. So a labourer is not well paid, and the soldiers were paid less than the labourer. Also, of course, the conditions were very, very tough. So if there's a shortage, obviously, they've got to do something about it. They've got to overcome it. They've got to recruit. Now, how did they do that? Well, they used a variety of methods, and I'm going to run through them now over the next few minutes. Method number 1. One of my favourite sweets. Other chocolate bars are available, ladies and gentlemen. Bounty. Now, what's this all about? A bounty. Well, bounty has another meaning. The word bounty, almost like a money bonus. So what's going on here? Some soldiers, or even people who were not in the army, were paid a bounty. They were paid money to bring these labourers to the army. And they would say, right, you've brought so many men that can now join the army. Here, have a bonus, have a bounty, have some money. The men themselves who are enlisting or joining the army, they were often paid a bounty as well, a one-off payment. Now, sometimes it would be between £3 and £5. That was quite a lot of money. In today's money, maybe £250 to £500. So they decided that it was worth taking this bounty to join the army. Now then, sometimes the recruitment happened in the pubs. Hey, cheers, let's have some beer. So, what could we see? Well, we could see a poem like this. Hey you, do you fancy some beers? Just sign up for 8 to 12 years. It's the army life, so cheers. Join us with no fears. For a life of fun and no tears. Hey! Sorry about the poem, terrible. But a lot of recruitment went on in the pubs. Because basically they got these people drunk and said, sign up. Yeah, that's a great idea. Here's your bounty. Here's your £2, £3, £4. Well, hey, let's get drunk. Let's spend the bounty. What about when they sobered up? Oh, my goodness me, I've joined the army for 8 years. I didn't want to do that. Well, there was a system. Because they'd say, right, you need to swear an oath of loyalty, but we'll give you a cooling off period. Maybe 24 hours, you might change your mind. Yes, we will allow you to change your mind, but pay back the bounty. Well, the men may have spent it. And as well as paying back the bounty, pay an extra penalty of £1. Smart money, they called it. Smart, not as in intelligent, smart in the old-fashioned phrase, meaning pain, because it's going to give you pain to pay an extra £1, which many of them didn't have because they were so poor. So they ended up in the army. Basically, they were almost like kidnapped or forced to join. And these men who did the sort of kidnapping, they were known as crimps, a phrase that was used at that time. So that's another way that recruitment was actually made. How else could they get extra men into the army? Unbelievably, they toured the prisons. And they said to criminals or people in debt, debtors, we will give you your freedom, providing you join the army. And in the American War of Independence, 1776 to 1783, in the British Army were 7,000 men who had been in prison. What do you think the quality was like of these soldiers? Either men in prison, debtors, men who got drunk and joined up. What do you think? Would they be good soldiers? Well, I've already said a lot of them couldn't read or write. Many of them deserted. In the 10 years of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, over 50,000 deserted. It's why they had such strong discipline and flogging in the army. The Duke of Wellington himself, the leader of the English army at the Battle of Waterloo, referred to his own soldiers as the scum of the earth. So there's a problem there. How else could they get recruitment? Well, the government was reluctant to get involved because they knew that recruitment often led to unpopularity amongst the people. So what the government did, they were quite clever. They said, right, we're not going to get involved and get the blame. We're going to pay senior officers to do the recruitment. They can do the recruiting, clothing and equipping of their own area regiments. It was called the Colonel's Regiment. Now, again, these officers, these colonels, given a certain amount of money to raise men, well, if they do it on the cheap, they got more money themselves. So again, what would the quality be like? Just to point out to you, here we are in the 1700s, and we've got these colonels' regiments where officers are raising their own little army. Ladies and gentlemen, that's very similar to an idea that they had all the way back in medieval times, in the 13 and the 1400s, the captain's indentures. It's almost exactly the same system. If you want to check that out, go back and have a look at video number 6 to see that things have not changed that much. Another way of recruiting, 1757, the Militia Act. Now, what's going on there? Every local area, every parish in England and Wales had to list all of the men in that parish aged between about 18 and 45 or 50. Then they would have a vote, a ballot, and they would select, just at random, from the list, men who would have to serve for 5 years in the militia, doing local service. Now, they wouldn't be sent overseas at first. They're not in the army, they're in the militia at first. But later, in times of need, when more soldiers were needed to fight actual wars, e.g. the Napoleonic Wars, over 100,000 men in the British Army were original militiamen. So that's how they are recruiting. So, one final thing on recruitment. Remember when I was saying about the officers? And they would often buy their way in. And I was comparing it to the new model army. Remember, in the new model army, it was all about how good you were, not how rich you were or who your relatives were. Sadly, things had changed, because in the 17 and the 1800s, it often did depend on who your relations were. An example of that, in the 1800s, towards the 1850s, the leader of the army, the commander-in-chief, was a man called Lord Raglan, and he had military secretaries working for him. Ladies and gentlemen, 5 of those military secretaries were his nephews. That is nepotism, giving jobs to your family. Were they the best for the job? Who knows? But it's a little bit surprising, isn't it, that 5 of the people in those jobs were all related to Lord Raglan. 1978, great song by Sister Sledge. We are family. I got all my sisters with me. Well, Lord Raglan wouldn't sing that. Oh no, he'd say, we are family. I got all my nephews with me. But it's wrong. And that's what was going on in the British Army. Recruitment. What about training, ladies and gentlemen? Well, there were some attempts to bring about change, 1700 to 1850. But remember, it was very slow and very gradual. Most things still stayed the same as regards training. Let's have a look at some examples. 1708, right at the start of the industrial period, Duke of Marlborough says, right, we need a new manual, a new sort of training book, and it's called The New Exercise of Firelocks and Bayonets, dealing with the newer type of weapons. A great idea, you would think. Right, let's have a look at this booklet, see how to use our weapons. It was largely ignored, ladies and gentlemen. King George II. Now, he was the last king ever to actually lead, English king, ever to actually lead the English army in battle, 1743, the Battle of Dettingen. He introduced a series of regulations, again aimed at trying to improve the training of the soldiers. Again, largely ignored. There were some successes, some small changes. 1741, the Royal Military Academy was set up at Woolwich in London. And there, what they did was they tried to teach gunnery for the new artillery. And again, there was some limited success here. Woolwich, part of London. Now, some of you who like football, did you know that there's a team called Arsenal? Now, they were originally called Woolwich Arsenal. Do you know what's on the Arsenal shirt? What their badge is? Anyone know? Well, have a look. It's a cannon. It's gunnery because of this that was set up in Woolwich, the official training for gunnery or artillery. Just a little bit of nonsense there for you. But the point is, they're trying to improve gunnery, only limited success. Again, 1800, so right in the middle of the period, Royal Military College set up at Sandhurst to train existing officers and also to train cadets, 1802, training cadet officers. Again, still only some small limited success there. Why? Why were people so resistant to change? Well, it's to do with the attitudes of society at the time. The soldiers themselves, the officers themselves, tended to think, look, weapons training, tactics, it's all very simple, it's all very straightforward, we'll learn it on the job, there's no real need to change the system. Leave it to us, everything will be fine. And so because of that, there was no real desire for change. Now, the final part of the video, the impact of war on civilians, 1700 to 1850. And again, it's continuity. Things stayed the same. There wasn't that much change. What are we looking at? Well, civilian deaths. They were again very, very small. There was hardly at all any fighting here in Britain because we had our navy to protect the country, which is an island. The navy was important to stop enemy armies actually getting onto our shore. So civilian deaths, no impact. What about recruitment? Well, I've mentioned the Militia Act, 1757. When that came in, there were some riots against it. Remember, I said it was unpopular. So there was some impact there. Requisitioning. That means the army themselves taking wagons, for example, from civilians to help with the transport of their weapons and supplies. Again, there was some impact there, the way that there had been through the 15 and the 1600s as well. What about accommodation? Lodgings for the army? Well, up to about 1800, there was some disturbance to business because the army would have to be put in towns and cities, and it disturbed their business as they were often very rowdy. From about 1800 onwards, we begin to get barracks, official residences, and places for the soldiers to stay away from the civilians. So up to 1800, there was an impact. After 1800, not quite as much. It became less of a problem. What about the impact of money? It's always an issue, ladies and gentlemen. Well, taxes. The army had to be paid for, so taxes had to be paid. 1700, the army cost about £1 million. 1700, there were about 6 million people paying £1 million. By 1836, the cost of the army has gone up to 8 million. But there's now 26 million paying tax. 26 million people for £8 million, as opposed to 6 million people for £1 million. So, although the burden was there, in peacetime, there's more people to spread that burden. What about in times of war? Well, obviously in times of war, the cost is much higher. The impact is much worse. In the Napoleonic Wars, the army cost about £25 million a year. And the actual war itself cost about 550 million. So there is a spike, an increase in taxation, which impacts the civilians during times of war. So there is an impact there. But let's go back to what we started with. Hopefully I've tried to show you that in recruitment, training, and impact of war on civilians from 1700 to 1850, things pretty much stayed the same. Then we get to this year, 1850, and things begin to change. And there's our key question. Why? Why do things change so much from 1850 to 1900? Recruitment, training, impact of war on civilians, change. Why? Have a look at the next video and I'll try and explain that to you. As ever, I hope it's been useful. All the best. Speak to you soon. Bye now.